Imagine you're on a flight, cruising high above the clouds, enjoying the serenity of your journey, when suddenly the unthinkable happens. The captain, a man you've never met, storms down the aisle with a look of pure anger. Without a moment's hesitation, he approaches a woman sitting in her seat, someone who's been quietly minding her business, and in front of everyone, punches her right off the plane. It's an unbelievable scene, yet that's exactly what happened on a flight that should have been like any other. The woman in question, a billionaire, someone with power, wealth, and influence. But the captain? He had no idea who he was dealing with. You see, her father owns the airline. This shocking encounter starts with a simple misunderstanding, a clash of egos, and a moment of judgment that could change everything. But as the dust settles and emotions simmer, a deeper, more explosive revelation emerges. The captain's actions have triggered something much larger than he could have ever imagined. Now, as tension builds, we're left to wonder, how will this powerful woman, humiliated in front of the entire cabin, react to this public display of disrespect? Will her father, the airline owner, get involved and make the captain pay for his rash decision? Or will the story twist in ways none of us expected? But wait, there's more. What happens next will have you questioning everything you thought you knew about power, privilege, and how easily things can spiral out of control when the wrong person crosses the wrong line. In the next part, we'll dive deeper into the aftermath, the fallout, and the shocking revelation that no one saw coming. Stick around, because this story is far from over. You won't believe what happens next. As the plane leveled off and the flight attendants began their usual rounds of snack and drink service, most passengers were blissfully unaware of the tension that had just unfolded at the front of the cabin. The woman, who had been punched and shoved off her seat, sat in a daze for a moment. She had been jolted by the physical assault, but remained remarkably calm, her eyes betraying only the faintest flicker of disbelief. The captain, a tall man with sharp features and a military-like presence, was red-faced and seething with anger. His actions seemed almost instinctual, driven by some perceived slight that none of the passengers could understand. His temper was as sudden as it was fierce, and it was clear from the look in his eyes that he believed he had every right to act as he did. But as the chaos unfolded, no one realized just how badly the captain had miscalculated. The woman, now slowly getting to her feet, took a deep breath. She wasn't afraid, not yet, at least. Her eyes, sharp as ever, scanned the room for a moment. The plane, now quieter after the scuffle, had become a sort of theater for the dramatic moment, the other passengers too stunned to speak or even move. It was then that the flight attendant, a young woman who had witnessed the incident from a distance, moved quickly to the woman's side. "Are you okay?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the plane. The woman didn't immediately respond. Instead, she looked down at the seat where she had been sitting just moments before, her purse still on the armrest, her drinks spilled onto the floor. With a careful, controlled motion, she lifted her phone from her bag and began tapping quickly. The flight attendant, noticing the change in her demeanor, hesitated. This wasn't a woman who was used to being treated this way, and the flight attendant could tell that whatever happened next, it wasn't going to be pretty. "Let me help you with your things," the flight attendant said, reaching for the spilled drink. "No need," the woman replied, her voice calm but with a sharp edge. "I'll handle this myself." As the woman straightened up, the captain, still standing at the front of the aisle, turned to face her. His expression was a mixture of smugness and self-righteousness, as though he had just performed some kind of necessary act to maintain order on the plane. But it wasn't just any act, it was an act of aggression, one that didn't sit well with the woman who now looked him square in the eye. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice low but firm. The captain laughed dismissively. "I'm not making any mistakes, ma'am. You were being disruptive." The woman's eyes narrowed. "I wasn't being disruptive, and if you knew who I was, you wouldn't have laid a finger on me." The captain's arrogance faltered for just a moment. He hadn't expected this. After all, who could this woman possibly be? She certainly didn't look like someone with connections, at least not in the way the captain might have imagined. She wasn't dressed in flashy clothes or draped in jewelry, nor did she give off the usual airs of a celebrity or socialite. To him, she was just another passenger. But the words she had just spoken seemed to carry weight beyond what he could understand. The woman was calm, composed, too composed. There was something about her presence that suggested she wasn't a typical flyer. Before the captain could respond, a man sitting near the back of the plane, a businessman in his mid-50s, stood up. He had been watching the interaction closely, his brow furrowed in concern. "Excuse me," he said, his voice cutting through the tension in the cabin, "but I don't think you understand the situation. You need to apologize, Captain." The captain's gaze snapped to the man. "I'm the one in charge here. If you don't like it, you can leave the plane too." The businessman raised an eyebrow, as if he had just heard something utterly absurd. "I'm not going anywhere. You, on the other hand, might want to be careful. That woman you just assaulted, you don't know who she is." The captain scowled. "I don't care who she is. She broke the rules. She's off the plane." "That's where you're wrong," the businessman replied, his voice growing more urgent. "She's not just anyone. She's the daughter of the man who owns this airline." For a moment, the plane seemed to hold its breath. The captain's expression shifted from irritation to confusion, and then to disbelief. "What?" The businessman glanced over at the woman, who had returned to her seat with a quiet dignity. Her eyes remained fixed on the captain, unwavering, as though daring him to process the reality of the situation. The woman spoke again, her tone colder now. "That's right. My father owns this airline, and you just assaulted his daughter. So congratulations, Captain. You've just made the biggest mistake of your career." The captain's face drained of color as the full weight of her words hit him. The airline he worked for, the airline that had been his pride and joy for over a decade, was owned by this woman's father. And she wasn't just some random passenger. She was someone with the power to bring his world crashing down. It was as if the ground had shifted beneath his feet. He stumbled backward, but his mind raced with panic. What had he done? In a moment of frustration, he had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. The consequences of his actions were only beginning to take shape, but the damage was already done. For the woman, however, this wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about anger or retribution. It was about maintaining control. As the captain's mind whirled, she sat back in her seat and closed her eyes, preparing herself for the next move. She knew what she had to do, but there was a bigger game at play here. A game where the stakes were much higher than the petty squabble that had just unfolded. The captain, now visibly sweating, avoided eye contact with her. He knew he couldn't get away with what he'd done, but what could he possibly do now? And what would her father say when he found out? Would he fire him on the spot? Would he seek revenge in his own way? As the plane continued its journey, the atmosphere in the cabin remained thick with tension. No one spoke. The passengers who had witnessed the scene were either too afraid or too confused to intervene. They had seen enough to know that this was no ordinary altercation. This was about power. And as the woman sat quietly, waiting for the storm to hit, one thing became painfully clear. This was only the beginning. What would the captain do next? Would he grovel and apologize? Would he try to salvage his career? Or would the woman's father, the man who owned the airline, intervene in a way that would turn this entire situation upside down? No one knew, but what was certain was that the ripples from this confrontation would be felt far beyond the confines of this flight. The rest of the flight passed in uneasy silence. The hum of the engines was the only sound that filled the cabin, but beneath it, the tension simmered, building like a storm on the horizon. The woman who had been punched was no longer speaking. She sat there, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes closed, lost in thought. The captain, meanwhile, remained at the front of the plane, his gaze shifting uneasily between the cockpit and the cabin, though he dared not make eye contact with anyone. His mind was racing, running through every possible scenario of what would happen when the plane landed. He had seen enough power struggles in his life to know that this was no ordinary passenger. His hands, still clenched in anger from the moment of confrontation, were now shaking with a mix of fear and regret. He knew how fast things could spiral when you made an enemy of someone with money, influence, and connections. But what had really struck him was her calmness. There was no anger in her demeanor, no outward sign of vengeance, just an eerie, almost chilling quiet. It was like she knew exactly what was coming, like she had already played out every possible consequence in her mind. The flight attendants, who had been witness to the scene, moved with nervous efficiency, but it was clear they were just as unsettled as the passengers. A few tried to offer the woman a drink or a blanket, but she declined each time, her focus elsewhere. The whispers among the passengers were growing louder as people started piecing together the situation. They had no idea who the woman was, but the way the businessman had spoken, with such authority, made them uneasy. They knew something big had just happened, something that was bigger than any minor incident. Meanwhile, the businessman, who had stood up to defend her, was sitting in the back, his own mind turning. He had seen many corporate power struggles in his day, but this felt different. The woman's words had been calm, yet they carried the weight of a warning. He had no doubt that she was in control of the situation, but it wasn't just her presence that made him uneasy. It was the way she had reacted. There was something almost predatory in her restraint, something that hinted at a long history of not needing to show her power in obvious ways. She was used to making things happen without ever raising her voice, and that was a dangerous thing to witness. For the businessman, the question was not just about what would happen to the captain, but about how far-reaching this conflict could become. The airline industry was a competitive world, and power was always shifting. But even more than that, there was something personal to this situation, something that hinted at deeper, long-buried rivalries. He had been in the game long enough to know that every action had a consequence, and he wasn't sure if he wanted to be part of the fallout this time. Hours passed before the captain finally made an announcement over the intercom. His voice was tight, strained, betraying the tension that was clearly gripping him. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be landing shortly. Please make sure your seat belts are fastened and your seats are in the upright position. Thank you for choosing Airline name." The woman didn't flinch at the mention of the airline's name, but a subtle shift in her posture suggested she was preparing herself for the inevitable. The captain had no idea what he was about to walk into. He knew there would be consequences, but he hadn't yet figured out exactly what they would look like. The plane touched down at the airport, and as it taxied to the gate, the woman stood up. She moved with the quiet confidence of someone who was accustomed to having their presence felt, but this wasn't the usual kind of authority. This was the kind of power that could change everything with a single phone call, a single word. She gathered her things and walked to the front of the plane, where the captain was still standing, his hands gripping the railing in front of him, trying to steady his nerves. The flight attendants made way for her, but no one dared say a word. The moment she reached the front, she turned to face the captain. Her eyes, cold and piercing, met his for what felt like an eternity. The captain opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He wanted to apologize, to explain that he had been in the wrong, but something in her gaze told him that apologies wouldn't be enough. He didn't know what he was up against. He hadn't realized that the woman wasn't interested in making him feel guilty, she was interested in making him pay. Before the captain could say anything, the woman took out her phone. She tapped something on the screen, then raised it to her ear. The captain watched in silence, his heart hammering in his chest. She was making a call that could change his entire career. "Hello, Dad," the woman said into the phone, her voice soft but unmistakably calm. "Yes, I'm fine, but I need you to do something for me. The captain on this flight just punched me in the face, and I think it's time we had a little conversation about the future of this airline." The captain's eyes widened, but he didn't move. His thoughts were racing, trying to process what he had just heard. Her father, the owner of the airline. This was a nightmare. He had just assaulted the daughter of the most powerful person in the company, and she was making sure he knew it. The woman listened for a moment, nodding slowly. "Yes, I'll be waiting for you. Thank you, Dad. She hung up and returned her phone to her purse, not sparing the captain a second glance. He stood frozen, not sure whether to apologize or defend himself, but it was clear he was in a battle he had already lost. As the passengers began to disembark, whispers spread like wildfire through the crowd. The captain tried to maintain his composure, but he couldn't shake the feeling that his world was unraveling. The woman, with her quiet confidence and her father's power behind her, was playing a game he wasn't prepared for. As the last of the passengers filed off the plane, the businessman who had spoken up earlier approached the captain. His expression was no longer sympathetic, but calculating. "You're in deep trouble, Captain," he said, his voice low. "I'm not sure how much help I can be at this point." The captain didn't respond. He was too shaken to speak. The businessman gave him one last look before turning and walking off the plane, leaving the captain alone with the weight of the storm that was about to hit. Outside the plane, the woman waited. Her father was on his way, and when he arrived, it would be the beginning of the end for the captain. But the question remained, how far would her father go to make this right? And was this just a personal vendetta, or was there something bigger at play here? The answer, of course, was still unknown. But one thing was certain, nothing would ever be the same for the captain again, and for the woman, the game was only just beginning. The airport terminal was bustling with activity, but for the captain, the noise and movement around him faded into the background. He was in a daze, his thoughts still spinning from the confrontation on the plane and the chilling conversation he just overheard. He had made a grave mistake, but the weight of it hadn't fully hit him until now. The woman, calm as ever, had walked off the plane, and he could only assume that her father was on his way. But what would happen when he arrived? What kind of retribution was waiting for him? Every step the captain took toward the exit felt heavier than the last. He had worked his entire life to get to this point, to earn the trust and respect of his colleagues, to have a stable career. And now it felt as though it was all slipping through his fingers. The thought of facing the woman's father, the owner of the airline, terrified him. He could already imagine the man's cold, calculating eyes, the way his words would slice through any attempts at defense. What could he possibly say? What could he do? As the captain moved toward the waiting area, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message, one he almost didn't want to read, but he knew he had no choice. Slowly, with shaking hands, he pulled the phone from his pocket and unlocked it. The message was brief, but it cut straight to the point. *, meet me at gate 7. Now, *. He didn't need to ask who it was from. He knew. The woman's father had arrived. His heart pounded in his chest as he made his way toward gate 7. The terminal seemed to stretch on forever, each step feeling like it took him deeper into a nightmare that was only just beginning. He passed through the crowds of travelers, but none of them mattered. His entire focus was on what awaited him at the gate. When he reached the gate, he paused. There, standing by the door, was the woman, but this time she wasn't alone. A tall, imposing figure stood beside her, her father. The man exuded power, even in the casual setting of the airport. He wore a dark suit, perfectly tailored, his face calm but unreadable. His presence alone sent a chill down the captain's spine. The air around them seemed to crackle with tension. Without saying a word, the captain stepped closer, his legs heavy, as though the ground beneath him had turned to lead. The woman's father turned to him, his expression unreadable. "Captain," he said, his voice low but authoritative, "I trust you know why you're here." The captain swallowed hard. "Yes, sir." The man's gaze never wavered. "Good, because we don't have time for games. You've crossed a line, and now you will deal with the consequences." The words hit the captain like a punch to the gut. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. There was nothing he could say. He couldn't apologize his way out of this one. He couldn't explain that it had been a moment of frustration, that he had acted out of line, but didn't mean any harm. The damage was done. His fate had already been sealed. The woman's father turned to his daughter, giving her a brief nod. She stepped forward, her face as calm and emotionless as ever. You don't get it, do you? She asked, her voice carrying an edge of something dangerous. This isn't just about an apology. This is about respect. You humiliated me in front of everyone on that plane. You didn't think for 1 second about what could happen when you laid your hands on me. But now you're going to learn. The captain's stomach churned. He had no idea what she meant, but the words alone were enough to send a wave of dread through him. He wanted to ask what was going to happen, but he already knew. Whatever it was, it wouldn't be pretty. There was no way out of this. I gave you a chance, the woman continued, her voice growing colder with each word. A chance to walk away from this without making it worse. But you chose to escalate it. And now you'll face the consequences of your actions. The silence that followed felt suffocating. The captain stood there, his heart racing, his mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. The woman's father had yet to speak, but his presence alone seemed to weigh on the captain like 1,000 pounds. The look in his eyes was enough to make the captain feel like a child caught in a lie. He knew that whatever happened next, it was going to be something he couldn't undo. And then, as though on cue, the woman's father finally spoke. "Captain, I want you to understand something," he said, his tone eerily calm. "This isn't just about the airline. This isn't just about what you did to my daughter. This is about principle. And you've broken a very important one. You never, ever, disrespect my family." The captain's throat went dry. He wanted to speak to explain himself, but he couldn't. The weight of the man's words seemed to choke the life out of him. He was cornered. There was no escape. The woman stepped closer, her eyes narrowing as she looked him over one last time. "I'll let you go for now," she said, her voice cold. "But don't think for a second that this is over. You'll hear from us soon. And when you do, remember this moment. Remember that you made this choice. I'm not the one who's going to make you regret it. My father is." The captain stood motionless, frozen in place as the two of them turned and walked away, leaving him standing there, his mind reeling. He had thought the worst was over, but now he understood that this was just the beginning. The power they wielded, the resources they had at their disposal, he hadn't even begun to understand the full scope of what he was facing. As he watched them disappear into the crowd, he felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He had no idea what was coming next, but he knew one thing for sure. It was going to be far worse than anything he could have imagined. The woman's calm demeanor, her father's chilling words, they were a warning, one that he had no choice but to heed. But would it be enough? Would he survive whatever consequences lay ahead? He didn't know. And as the minutes stretched on, the question lingered in the air, unanswered and full of dread. What would happen to him now? The captain stood there, his mind still reeling from the confrontation. The tension in his chest hadn't eased, and he could feel his heart beating faster with each passing second. The woman and her father were gone, but their presence lingered, a weight pressing down on him. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. In fact, it felt as though it had only just begun. His instincts told him that something wasn't right, that there was more to this situation than a simple act of disrespect on a plane. The captain had spent years in the aviation industry, learning the ins and outs of power, reputation, and how to survive in a world where everything was a transaction. But this wasn't like anything he'd ever faced before. Still, he tried to shake it off, focusing on the practical steps ahead. He had a meeting scheduled with his superior later that evening, and it was already clear that this situation with the woman was going to come up. But the truth was, he didn't know how to explain it. He had acted out of line, yes, but even now, in the silence of the terminal, he felt something gnawing at him. A sense that the woman had known exactly how things would play out, like she had anticipated every move he would make. It unsettled him more than he cared to admit. But just as he was about to head toward the exit, another message pinged on his phone. His heart skipped a beat as he saw the name on the screen. *HR Department, URGENT*. The subject line made his blood run cold. *Immediate suspension. Flight incident review *. Without a moment's hesitation, the captain opened the email, his eyes scanning the words quickly. His throat tightened as he read the message. Captain, due to the recent incident involving passenger, name redacted, on Flight 217, we are initiating an immediate investigation into your conduct. Effective immediately, you are suspended from all flight duties until further notice. A meeting will be scheduled to discuss your future with the airline. It felt like the ground had been pulled out from beneath him. He had suspected it was coming, but seeing the words in black and white, knowing that his job, his career, was now on the line, was a shock to his system. He could barely breathe as his mind raced, trying to process what this would mean. The consequences weren't just professional, they were personal. His reputation was at risk, his livelihood hanging by a thread. The email continued with details about the investigation, but the captain barely registered them. The one thing that stood out was the final sentence. Asterisk, please be aware that the family of the passenger involved has filed an official complaint. Asterisk, he didn't need to read any more to understand what that meant. The woman hadn't just been a random passenger. She had made sure that her complaint would carry weight. Her father, the owner of the airline, had already ensured that every angle was covered, that every move was planned. This wasn't just an isolated incident, it was a carefully orchestrated power play, and he had walked right into it. He stared at the phone, his hands shaking as the weight of it all settled in. This wasn't just about a punch on a plane anymore. This was about his entire future, and the odds of him coming out of this unscathed were quickly fading. Suddenly, the captain's phone buzzed again, but this time it was a phone call. He hesitated, his finger hovering over the screen, but eventually he swiped to answer. Captain, a cold voice on the other end said. It was the voice of his superior, the one who had just signed off on the suspension. I trust you've received the email. Yes, the captain managed to croak, his throat tight. You're to report to the head office tomorrow morning. And let me be clear, the voice continued, we have no room for any more mistakes. This investigation is serious. It's bigger than you. We're already seeing pressure from upper management, and if this goes south, well, I don't need to spell it out. The captain nodded, but there was no use. His mind was elsewhere, racing with panic and questions. He wasn't just facing a suspension anymore, he was facing the possibility of losing everything. The future he had worked so hard for was now in jeopardy, all because of a single moment of misplaced aggression. Before he could say anything else, his superior hung up. The phone dropped into his hand like a weight, and for a long moment, he just stood there, staring at it, unsure of what to do next. But before he could make a decision, his phone buzzed once again. This time, a notification popped up, asterisk message from unknown number. Asterisk. He hesitated, unsure if he should open it, but curiosity got the better of him. His thumb hovered over the screen, and as soon as he read the first few words, his blood went cold. Captain, I hope you're not too comfortable just yet. You might want to take a look at this before you make any more plans. A link followed, and despite his better judgment, he clicked it. His phone instantly loaded a video he hadn't expected. It was footage from inside the plane. The camera angle was shaky, but it was clear that it had been taken from a passenger's phone. The video showed the moment he had confronted the woman, the moment he had punched her in the face. But what made the captain's heart stop wasn't the footage itself. It was the fact that in the video, the woman wasn't just a random passenger. There was something in the background that he hadn't noticed before, the logo on the man's jacket in the foreground. It was faint, but unmistakable. The man standing next to the woman, the one who had stayed silent throughout the entire altercation, was wearing the uniform of a senior executive from the airline. The realization hit him like a thunderclap. This wasn't just about an incident with a billionaire's daughter. This was a setup. The woman had known exactly what she was doing, and her father had orchestrated every step of it. The man beside her wasn't just any businessman. He was a part of the airline's own executive team, a high-ranking official who was now probably working to bury the entire incident under layers of corporate red tape. The stakes had just been raised to a whole new level. What had seemed like a simple mistake on the captain's part was now a full-scale corporate conspiracy, and he had no idea how deep it went. The video wasn't just evidence of his misconduct, it was evidence that he had been played from the start. A wave of nausea swept over him. He wasn't just fighting for his job now. He was fighting for his freedom. The captain's mind was racing as he stared at the video on his phone. Every detail seemed to shift into place like the final pieces of a jigsaw puzzle he'd never intended to complete. He had been set up. The woman, calm and poised, hadn't just been a passenger on the plane. She was a player in a much larger game, and he had unwittingly become the pawn. The video, showing the senior executive standing next to her, confirmed what he had feared. The entire confrontation was part of a plan to destroy him, and it was happening faster than he could process. Panic surged through him as he shoved the phone into his pocket. His thoughts were a blur, but there was one thing he knew for sure. He needed answers. He needed to understand what was really going on. The pieces of the puzzle had begun to fit, but the full picture was still beyond his reach. What had started as a simple altercation on a plane had turned into a corporate power struggle. The stakes were higher than he had ever imagined, and now his future hung in the balance. The next morning, the captain arrived at the head office, his heart thudding in his chest. He was early, but he knew there was no time to waste. The meeting was set for 9 a.m., but his mind couldn't stop racing. He needed to find a way out of this, anything, that would keep his career intact. As he walked into the building, he passed the familiar faces of his colleagues, their gazes barely acknowledging his presence. He couldn't shake the feeling that they all knew what was coming, that the whispering had already begun behind closed doors. When he entered the conference room, the atmosphere was thick with tension. His superior was already seated at the head of the table, his expression as cold and unreadable as ever. But this time, there was someone else in the room, an unfamiliar man dressed in a sharp suit, his face calm, but with an air of authority that made the captain's stomach churn. The man's eyes flicked toward the captain as he entered, but he didn't speak. "Captain," his superior said, gesturing to the chair across from him. "Please, take a seat." The captain sat down, his palms sweating. The silence in the room felt oppressive, like they were waiting for him to make the first move. But he had nothing to say. He had already heard the rumors, the whispers about the woman's father, and now he was face to face with the reality of the situation. After a long, uncomfortable silence, his superior finally spoke. "We've reviewed the footage, and we've spoken with the executives. The situation you were involved in is far more serious than we initially realized." The captain's heart sank. He knew where this was going, but hearing it out loud was something entirely different. He clenched his fists, trying to keep his composure. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," he said, his voice tight. "It was a mistake, a bad decision in the heat of the moment." His superior nodded, but didn't offer any sympathy. "I'm afraid that doesn't matter now. You've crossed a line, and we can't ignore that." The captain took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. This was it. This was the moment where everything would come crashing down. But just as he was about to speak, the unfamiliar man in the suit leaned forward, his gaze locking onto the captain with an intensity that made his skin crawl. "I'm afraid," the man said, his voice low and calculated, "that you're missing the bigger picture." The captain frowned, confusion clouding his mind. "What do you mean?" The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "The incident on the plane, it wasn't just about you losing control. It was a strategic move. A move that was carefully orchestrated from the very beginning." The captain's stomach dropped. The words felt like a punch to the gut. "What are you talking about?" The man leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him. "We know about the video you received, the one that shows the senior executive on the plane with the woman. What you don't know is that the entire situation was engineered to create the perfect storm. It was a test." A test. The captain could barely believe what he was hearing. A test for what? The man's smile widened, but it still didn't reach his eyes. A test of loyalty. A test to see how far you would go to protect the airline. And unfortunately, Captain, you failed. The room seemed to close in on the captain. He felt as though the walls were pressing in, suffocating him with every word. He had been played. The whole thing was a setup. The woman, her father, the senior executive, it was all part of a larger plan to push him into a corner and test his resolve. They had wanted to see what he would do when faced with impossible choices. And now, they had their answer. His superior cleared his throat, breaking the captain's stunned silence. You see, Captain, this wasn't just about your actions. It was about how you would react when pushed. The real question now is whether you're willing to do what it takes to protect your position in the company. The captain's mind spun. The stakes had never been higher. The game they were playing was no longer just about him or the woman. It was about power, control, and the lengths the company was willing to go to maintain its grip. The captain was nothing more than a pawn in their game, and they had tested him, just as they had intended. I don't understand, the captain said, his voice barely above a whisper. What do you want from me? The man's smile finally reached his eyes. You'll have a choice, Captain. We're offering you a way out. A chance to redeem yourself, but it will come at a cost. The captain's pulse quickened. What kind of cost? The man leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. The woman you encountered on the plane, she's not just a billionaire's daughter. She's a key player in this company's future. And if you want to stay on board, you'll need to make a deal with her. You'll need to find a way to fix this, before it's too late. The captain's mind reeled. It was a choice he never expected. He could try to salvage his career, to work with a woman who had set him up, or he could risk losing everything. It was a dangerous game, and he had no idea where it would lead. But just as he was about to respond, the door to the conference room opened. A figure stepped in, and the captain froze. It was her, the woman from the plane, but this time she wasn't alone. She was flanked by 2 security guards, and her expression was cold, calculating. She didn't speak a word as she walked toward the table, her eyes never leaving the captain's. The tension in the room skyrocketed. The final twist hit the captain like a freight train. The woman wasn't just a player in the game, she was the one pulling the strings. And as she sat down at the table, her gaze locked on the captain's, she smiled. Let's talk about your future, she said, her voice chillingly calm. Because this isn't over yet. The captain's heart pounded in his chest. He had no idea what he had just stepped into, but he knew one thing for sure. It was a game he wasn't ready to play. And the worst part? He didn't know if he'd be able to survive it. The tension in the room was palpable as the woman settled into her seat, her eyes locked on the captain. The 2 security guards flanked her, their presence unnerving in its silence. The captain's heart raced as he tried to process the gravity of the situation. Every instinct in him told him to stand up, to leave the room, and walk away from this twisted game. But he knew that wouldn't be possible now. This had gone too far, and the only way out was to play along. The woman smiled at him, a cold, calculated smile that sent chills down his spine. She hadn't come here to negotiate. She had come to dominate. The captain had been right all along. This wasn't about a simple misunderstanding on a plane. It was a move in a much larger game, a game of power, control, and influence. And the stakes were higher than he could have ever imagined. You look surprised, she said, her voice calm but laced with authority. I guess you didn't expect me to be the one pulling the strings, did you? The captain swallowed hard. His thoughts raced. He had been nothing more than a pawn in their game, and now he was face to face with the one who had orchestrated it all. What do you want from me? He asked, trying to keep his voice steady. She leaned forward slightly, her gaze never leaving his. I want you to understand that this isn't just about your actions anymore. This is about control. This is about the future of the airline, and I need to know if you're willing to fight for it. He was taken aback. Fight for it? How? What are you asking me to do? She raised an eyebrow, almost amused by his confusion. You're a captain, right? You're used to making tough decisions, to leading when it counts. Well, I need someone like you, someone who can make the hard calls, even if they're not popular. But I need you to work with me, to help me fix the mess this company is in." The captain's mind reeled. The woman wasn't here to punish him. She was offering him a chance. A chance to redeem himself, but it came with conditions he wasn't sure he could accept. He thought about the suspension, the video, the humiliation. He thought about his career, his reputation, and the shattered trust with his colleagues. Could he really align himself with the woman who had been behind his downfall? Could he stomach working with someone who had manipulated him so easily? But then he looked at her, and something in her eyes told him that there was more at play here than just personal vendettas. This was bigger than him, bigger than her. She had orchestrated everything, yes, but it wasn't just for power, it was for something else, something more important. And maybe, just maybe, he could use this opportunity to fix things, to right the wrongs he'd been part of, and take control of his own future again. "I'm listening," he said, finally giving in to the moment. The woman nodded, her expression softening just a fraction. "Good, because here's the truth. My father built this company, but he made some enemies along the way. Powerful enemies. And now those enemies are trying to take everything from us, everything he built." The captain frowned, his curiosity piqued. "You're saying this was all a setup to test me, to see if I could handle, what? A takeover?" "Exactly," she replied. "You're not the only one they've targeted. You've seen the cracks in the company, haven't you? The whispers about corruption, the shady deals, the politics that don't add up. My father's empire is crumbling, and I need someone who knows how to navigate the system, someone who can make the right choices in the heat of the moment, someone like you." The captain's mind was racing now. He had been so caught up in his own survival that he hadn't seen the bigger picture. The company he had worked for, the airline he had once been proud to serve, was under threat from within. And the woman sitting across from him was more than just a spoiled billionaire's daughter. She was the heir to a dynasty, someone who had inherited not only her father's wealth, but his enemies as well. "And what if I refuse?" the captain asked, though part of him already knew the answer. Her smile returned, this time more genuine, but still edged with danger. "Then I'm afraid you'll lose everything, your job, your career, and any chance of redemption. The board of directors is already turning on you. They've seen the video, and they're ready to cut ties. But if you work with me, we can stop them. We can save the company and restore what's been lost. But it's going to take more than just flying planes. It's going to take someone who's willing to fight for what's right." The captain didn't have to think long. He wasn't the type to back down from a challenge. And in that moment, he realized that he had two choices. He could walk away and lose everything, or he could join forces with the woman who had set him up and fight to take control of the chaos that was unfolding around them. He straightened in his chair, meeting her gaze. "All right, I'm in, but on one condition." The woman raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What condition?" "You tell me everything. No more secrets. I'm not going to be a pawn in this game. I need to know what's really going on if we're going to fix this." She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Fair enough. I'll fill you in. But be warned, Captain. What you're about to learn is bigger than anything you've ever dealt with, and once you're in, there's no turning back." The captain took a deep breath. The weight of the decision settled on his shoulders, but something inside him told him that this was his chance to make things right, to take back control. For the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of purpose, something he hadn't felt in weeks. As the woman began to explain the deeper layers of the conspiracy within the airline, the captain knew that this wasn't just about saving his job anymore. It was about uncovering the truth and fighting for something that mattered. He was no longer just a captain flying planes. He was a part of a battle that would determine the future of the airline and maybe even the future of the industry itself. And just as he thought he was starting to understand the stakes, the final twist came. The woman leaned forward again, her voice low and filled with a hint of something darker. "There's one more thing you need to know," she said, her eyes narrowing. The people behind all of this aren't just trying to take down my father's company. They're planning something far worse. And if we don't stop them, the consequences will be catastrophic. The captain's blood ran cold. He thought he knew what he was up against, but he had no idea just how deep the rabbit hole went. And now there was no turning back. As he listened to her final revelation, he understood. This was the beginning of a battle that would change everything. The game wasn't just about saving a company anymore. It was about survival, and the stakes had never been higher. The captain was in, and he was ready to fight.